Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for tonight's Early Bird Special, Top 3 Legal Tools for Protecting Your Property, presented by Braun and Gresham attorney and counselor, Margaret Menicucci. This is a brief presentation before we kick off tonight's Converting to Wildlife Management presentation at 6 p.m. Because we are so limited on time, we will not be taking questions for this portion of the presentation, but we will provide Margaret's contact information at the end in case you'd like to submit follow-up questions. Margaret, feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much, and welcome to this early bird, rather quick 15 minutes. I'm going to talk about some top legal tools for protecting your property. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. I have a helper here. Those 4 tools that we're going to focus on fairly quickly are business entities, guest waivers and leases on your property, estate planning, and then deed restrictions and conservation easements. And I look at protecting your property in 2 ways. So one way to protect your property is to protect it from liability. Like how, if there's liability arising in another part of your life, how do we ensure that the property isn't subject to that judgment? And then another way to protect your property is to ensure that you get to pass it on or use it in the way that you want. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the estate planning piece. So really useful tool for protecting your property from liability is the business entity. And there's 2 types of business entities that are primarily used for ranch property or agricultural property in Texas. One is a limited liability company, and the other is a limited partnership. They're similar. They have some little kind of nuances that make you go one way or another. When we use the term family limited liability company or family limited partnership, what we mean is that we're incorporating in the agreement provisions that make it easier to pass your interests between family members, but make it much harder for a third party to get into your family business. So we're adding protections in those agreements that ensure that this stays a family company and family land. The benefits that we get from these 2 entities are, first, that it protects non-homestead property. So if you've got your homestead on your rural land, there's significant creditor protection that the Constitution in Texas provides. But if it's your second property, if your homestead is in another location and the property is a second property, then the LLC and the limited partnership provide better creditor protection. And it protects against creditors outside of the land. For instance, maybe one of your partners gets into a bad car wreck and there's a big judgment in excess of insurance. If the company were held in a limited partnership or an LLC, that judgment creditor can't reach the land. They might get some proceeds from your partner's interest, but they can't reach the land. And the reverse is also true. If there's a big accident on the land that creates a lot of liability and there's a judgment, that judgment can't reach your personal assets because it, again, has been protected within the entity. So those are really valuable and something that we often help our clients set up. Let's go to the next slide. So guest waivers and leases are also an amazing tool for protecting against liability. And they're great because we have 2 important statutes in Texas that protect landowners. And one is the recreational use statute and the other one's the agritourism statute. The recreational use statute basically changes the duty that a landowner has to a guest coming on their property. And so if a guest were to get injured, the landowner only has liability if the injury was caused intentionally or recklessly by the landowner. If it's a negligent injury, they trip on, a cave in the ground that's visible, but they slipped and fell and broke an ankle, that's a negligent injury, and the recreational use statute is going to protect you from that. The agritourism statute also can protect farm and ranch owners when they have guests come to their property to enjoy it. So either for educational or recreational purposes. And this is actually a whole release of liability. So it's not just a change in in your duty. It's that you could be released from liability if that person were injured, that guest. And the way you accomplish the release of liability is you have to have certain signs up, and you have to have them sign a guest waiver that acknowledges that they understand they're coming onto rural land, that they're participating in this agritourism activity, and that they're releasing liability. An agritourism activity can be hiking around a rural property. It could be fishing or hunting. And so it really does cover a lot of the normal uses that we might have guests on the property doing, the normal activities they might be doing. The other two documents that are really helpful are grazing leases and hunting leases. And I know I get clients that tell me their hunting leases are all verbal, and I'm a lawyer and I want your hunting leases to be in writing, partly because it enables you to have you really clear with the hunters about what their activities are, what they can do and can't do, and what compensation is going to be. But also the hunting lease is an opportunity to include a guest waiver and make sure that they're waiving liability under that agritourism section recreational use statute. Same with grazing leases. We want to be real clear with someone who's grazing our property, who's responsible for activities occurring on the property related to that. And so I always encourage you to get some professional support and get the leases written correctly. Now we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Nick. Okay, this kind of protection is not just how do I avoid liability, but how, when my property means so much to me, do I ensure that it's going to pass to the next generation, potentially the way I want it to? Or also, how can I ensure that someone's not going to take advantage of me if I become ill or elderly, if I become vulnerable? And so estate planning is where we help you with that kind of protection. And the first is a will or a revocable trust. It's a document that helps you be really clear about who your executor is or your trustee, someone that you care about and know won't take advantage of you, usually a family member or a friend. And then who you want to receive this asset. And then receiving a ranch, inheriting a ranch can be problematic. There can be children who don't really interact with the ranch. They might live in a big urban area. There might be some that actually put in a lot of time and energy in the ranch. And so as lawyers, we help you kind of work out how do we balance these gifts? How do we pass them along in a way that everybody feels they've been treated fairly? Now, protecting you and your assets if you become disabled is accomplished through powers of attorney or a document called an advanced declaration of guardianship. And these are just tools that allow you, while you're healthy and clear-headed, to designate the kind of people and the names of people that you trust to take care of you if you become vulnerable or incapacitated, if you get to a place where you're easily influenced or can't make decisions for yourself. That's when you can be exploited and your land might be taken by someone you never intended to. So we try and do these advanced documents to protect you and to protect that land for your family. I'm double checking my timer over there. I don't want to go too long. Our last one and our last slide is deed restrictions and conservation easements. And this is how you can protect the uses of your property. And so you may decide that you really like the beautiful open space, or it's something that you either inherited or acquired, but that it's important to you as a legacy, the habitat, the agricultural uses, the fact that it's just a quiet sanctuary from other parts of your life are really important. And you want to see that quiet use and enjoyment can continue, and that rural agrarian use can continue. And so with deed restrictions, you might be able to dictate that the land is never subdivided beyond a minimum parcel size, maybe 20 or 30 acres. And you might also restrict against noisy, obnoxious uses or the types and sizes of structures that might be on the property. Deed restrictions require the support of your neighbors. So usually there are mutual restrictions among different landowners. Now those landowners could be different members of family. So, but you need to have multiple landowners participating so that there's an enforcement mechanism. Conservation easements are a different type of restriction, and they are a long-term protection against subdivision, against other kinds of uses that really aren't ranch and agricultural and open space uses. And a conservation easement is it's a very important and powerful tool. Because it's powerful, we guide families in thinking through it for multiple generations, because it will affect the land in perpetuity. And through a conservation easement, you give up rights to have very dense subdivision. You give up rights to have commercial development. And in giving up those rights, you may receive a charitable deduction for the loss in value, or you might even receive some compensation if leaving that land as open space has another public benefit. So an example of that second one, where you might be compensated for the public benefit, would be the city of San Antonio regularly enters into conservation agreements with landowners over the Edwards Aquifer to get them to agree to minimize development on their land and protect groundwater discharge, so that there's adequate water and clean water coming into the aquifer, which they use as their water supply. And so there's actual bond money for those types of conservation easements. They're not really common, but it's out there. And one of the things our firm does is help you find those kind of partners, assess if this is the right kind of tool for you and your land. So I think that covers it with 3 minutes to spare. As they introduced at the beginning, I'm Margaret Menicucci, and I do both conservation easement as well as risk management and estate planning at the law firm. There's my contact information. If you have a question arising from this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me. I'll be happy to get in touch with you.
That was great, Margaret. Thank you so much. Some very important reminders and best practices in there to consider.